Zimmerman to come and introduce this evening's lecturer.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Jens Zimmerman, visiting professor at Regent College for Philosophy, Theology, and Literature. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Drummond is here as part of a conference that we're currently running on technology and anthropology. The first slide, so it's not really hers, it's to draw your attention to our project. And if you want to check it out, there's the web link listed there. And so we're meeting here for 3 days to discuss this. And our project is funded, is supported by the Issachar Fund, so we're very grateful for that support for the project and for bringing Professor Deane-Drummond here. So Dr. Drummond is professor in theology and director for the Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. That was established in 2015. She has 2 doctorates, one in plant physiology and one in systematic theology. And her research interests have developed at the intersection of theology, ethics, and the biological and social sciences, particularly ecology, evolution, genetics, animal behavior, psychology, and evolutionary anthropology. She has published a great deal. She's joint editor of the International Journal of Philosophy, Theology, and the Sciences. She's on the executive board of the International Society of Science and Religion, and she was chair until recently of the European Forum for the Study of Religion and Environment until 2018. She's currently on sabbatical leave, a well-deserved break, I take it, from her post at Notre Dame, and she's a visiting research professor right now in Theology and Science at the University of Durham in the UK, and she has published a number of books. I'll just name a few here. Her most recent one, The Wisdom of the Liminal, Evolution and Other Animals in Human Becoming. Technofutures is another one. It's called Technofutures, Nature and the Sacred, a co-edited volume. Another book is Ecology in Jürgen Moltmann's Theology. And then I'll mention a couple of more. A primer in ecotheology, Theology for a Fragile Earth in 2017. And lastly, Theology and Ecology Across the Disciplines on Care for Our Common Home, 2018. So clearly all these are topics of great interest to us. And I would ask you to please welcome Professor Drummond, who will tonight address us on the topic of the lost soul of early hominins, humility, wisdom, and technology. Dr. Drummond, please come.
Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. And I want to thank, too, the hosts here at Regent College. Some of you may not know that I am actually an alumni of Regent College. I was here in the 1980s doing a postgraduate diploma in Christian Studies. And it was here that that seed of theological fascination was sown as a scientist. And I couldn't quite shake it off. So some years later, I decided to make the turn and immerse myself in studying theology, although I also couldn't quite leave science either, which is why I've ended up being a kind of hybrid. But today I'm going to talk about one little slice of some of the things I'm interested in at the moment on early human evolution. And earliest humans have been studied mostly through their bones by archaeologists and anthropologists, but relatively recently some anthropologists have started to ask questions about the inner mental world of those early hominins. And when anthropologists start asking these kinds of questions about what was it like to be a hominin actually then, in other words, what was it like to be a human, a beginning human at that stage in human history, then immediately they start to have more to talk about with theologians, because theologians are used to speculating about what humans are like, and I can also probe the anthropologists to ask different kinds of questions as well. It is quite a controversial area within anthropology to ask these kind of questions. Some anthropologists say, well, all we've got are the bones and we shouldn't speculate about the inner mental world of these very early humans. Others say, no, we need to put flesh, as it were, on those dry bones and actually start to bring what it was like to live in that time to life and maybe begin to understand our human history, that deep history which is so important if we're going to understand our futures. And that's another reason why I'm particularly interested in these early hominins. Because I think by understanding where we've come from in that deep history, in the light of our own understanding of Christian faith, we can also understand rather better about where we might go to next, which is another reason, as I said, why I'm here this evening. One of the easiest areas to look at when you're thinking about the mental world is compassion. And Penny Spickins and others who I'll be citing later on in this lecture have tracked the evolution of distinctively human compassion in the bones of early hominins by looking at particular diseases where it seems that the person who survived this particular disease couldn't possibly have lived unless they'd been cared for intensively by others. And I need to stress that this is very unusual for any other primate, doesn't do long-term care. So they may, if you like, gesture towards tenderness towards their kin over the short term, but it's long-term compassion, persistent compassion of extremely disabled and disadvantaged hominins that seems to be distinctively human. And that goes right back to Homo erectus, millions of years ago. In another project that we've been doing, we've been looking at wisdom as well. Maybe something like complex sociality would be also something that we could trace. And I'm not going to talk about those results today because there isn't really time. But if you're interested, I can do some summaries of some of that research. And it's proving, again, to be asking some very interesting questions, not about our human origins, but also about why it is that that wisdom exists at all, or what might be called wisdom, and how does that relate to our understanding of theological understanding of what wisdom is shaped like. But today I'm going to focus on ways of living socially in relation to the tool use, and I've given you, or shown in this first slide, a tool that was developed, and you might think, well, there's nothing particularly special in that particular rock. Well, actually, it's extremely difficult to craft one of these in the way that's repeatable over millions of years. Humility is implicated in this. And I'm going to take you through step by step and show you why that is the case. I also think that it is fascinating. Wisdom in particular is fascinating because it seems that in this creation of tools, an aesthetic sense started to develop. And that aesthetic sense must have, or is almost certainly, have pointed to something other than the day-to-day practical realities that these early hominins were facing. And in that sense, you could say, well, they began to have perhaps a sensibility to the divine. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. First of all, I want to oh, sorry, you didn't have this slide up. Sorry about that. I thought it was already there. The project that I want to acknowledge before I go any further is this project, Humility, Wisdom, and Grace in Deep Time. Now, it seems to me that this is echoing rather a lot. Is it echoing the back? No? Okay, that's okay. So Humility, Wisdom, and Grace in Deep Time was sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. And it allowed us, that is me, and collaborating with Agustin Fuentes, who's a chair of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame, to run a project between anthropologists, philosophers, and theologians at the Institute of Advanced Study in Stellenbosch in South Africa. Now, Stellenbosch is the cradle of human history. And so we managed to attract a number of very senior evolutionary anthropologists who are working in South Africa. And I wanted just to mention this at the start because many of these evolutionary anthropologists were deeply suspicious of saying anything to theologians. But Agustin Fuentes is a very persuasive man, and he persuaded them to come. So they spent a weekend with theologians. By the end of the weekend, they had changed their minds. They'd been converted, not converted to faith, but they'd been converted to thinking that it was worthwhile speaking to theologians. And I felt that was an incredible achievement because now for too long, I think that theology has been on the margins of academia. It's been like the Cinderella that's pushed away in the dark cellar are not allowed to speak in the, as it were, at the high table with the other sisters, the big sisters that are considered to be respectable academic subjects. But with this kind of research, what we're doing is showing that actually theologians, in the way that they think differently from the secular and the characteristic way of thinking and writing in other subjects, can actually ask some challenging questions that then promote and trigger new kinds of research and insights in the sciences and in the social sciences. And this is precisely what seemed to happen in this particular project. In addition to that, in this particular symposium, we heard about this new hominin called Homo Naledi that had been discovered by Lee Berger, some remains in South Africa near Cape Town. And the date of that particular hominin was found to be coterminous with Homo sapiens. And this was a remarkable announcement. So we heard this news before it had actually been released to the press. We were asked to keep Chatham House rules and not tell anyone immediately. So the whole thing was extremely dramatic and very exciting. And here is the team in more detail. Mark Kissel was the postdoctoral fellow who was working with us. Becky Artinian-Kaiser was the manager of the project. She did all the practical side of the work, and if it hadn't been for her efficiency, it wouldn't have gone as well as it had. And Agustin Fuentes, again, later wrote this book called The Creative Spark, and you can see the tool there. So right in the center of his understanding of the creativity of humans are these considerations of tools and tool use. So these artifacts then, these stone tools, lead to all kinds of speculations about why it is that they persisted over so many millions of years. Literally millions of years, they stayed almost the same. And my argument's going to be that in order to do that, it required a high degree of humility and respect for one another, and in imitation of a learning process that involved imitation as well as invention. And, but let's go back to the theological side of things and say, well, what is humility? And the reason I'm putting that explosion of stars on the outside of this image is because I believe that it's only really when we look at stars today we begin to have that sense of awe and humility and smallness that those early hominins must have felt when they faced the savannah and the very difficult environmental conditions in which they were in. It's very hard for us to go back to those kinds of times, but the closest we can probably get is by thinking about the universe and its vastness and our smallness. And my own definition is this, that humility is an accurate perception of self in relation to others, a preference for the valuation of the talents of others, a willingness to restrain desires for self-aggrandizement in the interests of cooperative action. And of course, theologically, in relation to others, in the primary sense, means in relation to God. But I'm going to build on that next. First, I want us to notice that this is a thick description about our inner world, the inner world of the self in relation to others. And humility in this sense is linked with the idea of the soul because it helps us to define who the person is in community. And humility is a prerequisite of things like our creative imagination, and also, I believe, a prerequisite for religious belief, because if we're not humble, we will not be receptive to the presence of God, and so we won't even have any kind of belief. So there are three basic arguments that I'm making today. First of all, humility is about the right recognition of ourselves in relation to God and in relation to others. Secondly, it's about a recognition of evolution, a particular kind of recognition within evolutionary anthropology that's more than simply our outer world. It's about our inner world as well. And that outer world of stone tools gives some representation of what's going on inside our inner world. And then thirdly, Thomas Aquinas, I believe, does a very good, it gives us a very good example of a very rich texture of what humility might look like, because within the monastic communities of his time, to some extent, and again, you can speculate on this, to some extent, those early monastic communities were probably more similar to the early hominin communities, because they're very intense, small, close-knit communities. But what about the biblical record on humility? Again, apologies that this particular slide or this discussion could be far more extensive, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just skate over some of this. In the first instance, humility opposes pride. And pride is also thought of as being the sin of the first humans. But if we look at Romans 11:18, for example, the Romans is literally peppered with references against pride. So do not be arrogant towards the branches, in talking about being grafted into the olive branch of Christ. 11:20, do not be conceited, but fear the Lord, etc. 11:25, someone will not be wise in your own eyes or in your own estimation. Again, in Romans 12 and 14, we have the same message. Give preference to one another in honor. 12:9. Someone is not to think more highly than they ought to think. In 12:3. Do not be haughty in one's mind, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So it's the same message again and again and again. As if it hasn't sunk in once, it has to be said again and again and again. So pride then is disruptive of human relationships, and it's disruptive of our relationship with God. But then there's the opposite that we can think through as well. Humility does the very opposite of what pride undoes, if you like. So if pride interferes with right relationships, humility enables it to be built up. Positive psychology has tended to underrate humility, but humility is not a lack of self-esteem, but a right estimate of what that self-esteem is like. And it also, in order for religious belief to be possible at all, it requires extreme humility, because we exist then in total dependence on God. 2 Corinthians 5:15, he died for all so that they who live might live may no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. So here again we have this idea of surrender. So not living for oneself, but living for God. And then Philippians 2:5-8, have this attitude in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who emptied himself and by becoming obedient to the point of death, and so on. And so this idea of self-emptying is also another version of even more extreme humility than most of us are even capable of considering. 1 Peter 5:5, again, all of you clothe yourselves with humility, and God gives grace to the humble. So that idea of God giving grace and clothing with humility is, if you like, the life of sainthood. And this is what our high calling is all about. But if we flash back then and say to ourselves, well, where does this ability to have humility, if it's so important in the Christian life, where might it have come from? And how could it have developed in the earliest human communities? And this is the question that I think is particularly interesting to think through, because it doesn't happen out of the blue, as it were. God works with the material stuff of which we are made, and also the material stuff with which we engage in early tool use. So at the dawn of human history then, there was a pre-conscious recognition of who God is, perhaps, but tool use must have required some sort of humility. And eventually, some of these tools became aesthetic, so they're not just functional anymore. They started to show forth these extraordinary art forms. And this particular example is from the University, shown now in the University of Cambridge in the archaeology department, a 500-year-old West Toft's hand axe. It's a remarkable achievement, and then maybe they viewed this shell around which this had been crafted as living, as having some sort of living form. Peter Hiscox is an evolutionary archaeologist who's worked in this area, and he's looked at different patterns in tool making in this period and earlier, back to the Oldowan period, which is some 2.6 million years ago. And he first of all says, well, why was there so much effort putting into these stone tools? Don't forget that these stone tools were repeated almost in an almost identical fashion, apart from maybe the shell one, which was fairly unique, again and again and again. What was going on in the mind of the hominins when they were making these? Was it some sort of complex signaling system between different people so that they, if you like, helped generate the sort of cultural and social structures of the time? These stone tools, the Oldowan period, again 2.6 million years ago, look fairly crude to us, but actually they're incredibly difficult to make, especially when you think about every sort of angle of those blades has to look exactly the same. And bear in mind too that Homo sapiens didn't appear till between 200 and 300,000 years ago. So this is far more ancient than Homo sapiens. The Tulian period, 1.6 to 1.7 million years ago, again, these were more complex tools which required hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice to get it right. Many of the landscapes around where these have been found are littered with the specimens of botched examples. So they tried and they failed and they tried again. They tried and they failed and they tried again. Some of the bits and pieces were recycled. It's obvious that some of them have been used more than once. So, archaeologists have decided that that you can see these patterns of design and production embedded in the landscapes in a way that really is quite fascinating. Another anthropologist, Dietrich Stout, says this: discovery of optimal technologies must be facilitated by social scaffolding, explicit instruction or high-fidelity imitation of an expert model, but minimally requires focused attention, self-monitoring, and inhibition of automatic reactions during repetitive practice. So in other words, you don't suddenly fly off the handle because you got it wrong. This, to me, is an example of what an archaeologist coming up with an expression that says these people are humble, but he didn't use that language because he doesn't maybe recognize that kind of language. So these tools as well are not just for hunting success, because any of these tools, you can see the huge variety here, could have been just as useful in terms of the practical tasks. So the question is, why are they so varied? And why did any of them change? Almost any of these morphologies could have had an equally equivalent function. The elongate flakes and the blades, some of which are shown here, also seem to appear and disappear in history in a way that the archaeologists don't really understand. Some of them were around for about 300,000 years, which makes our own sort of replacement mentality look very flimsy compared to the kind of faithfulness, as it were, with which these were reproduced. The period when these various stone tools were created was around the time of 1.8 million years ago with Homo erectus. So again, this is the middle Paleolithic period, and it prepared the way for a much later Mousterian period where things became rather more sophisticated. But again, these are incredibly difficult to do. The rocks that were used were often transported long distances, so there was deliberate thinking about this. So there's no way that any other animal can do anything like this. And Hiscox, again, believes that these lithic crafts formed quite complex signaling systems which involve both apprentice learning and learning with others and learning to imitate others, but also observing others and instructing others in quite a complex social class, if you like, or social arrangement. So it was a hive of activity, and you can imagine that they came together in these communities to learn and observe after patient work. Archaeologists who've tried to do this themselves have found that it's taken weeks sometimes to even begin to have some sort of resemblance to anything remotely acceptable in terms of function. And the Langda community in Papua province in Indonesia still crafts stone tools today. And if we look at their particular use of stone tools, it seems that there is quite high social value in the stone tool crafts that they make. Hiscox and others believe that there is a particular kind of social structure, or what he calls social scaffolding, that promotes this kind of learning. What's even more interesting is, if you're interested in psychology, which I am, is that the neural circuitry seems to change as a result of these kind of repetitive practices. And with that, these changes in the neural circuitry comes the ability to take on new roles, including that of reasoning and language. So there's a possibility that in making these stone tools over so many generations, the potential for language emerged in a way that it wouldn't have been the case otherwise. And so this enhanced self-control and persistence is something that comes up in the literature on time and time again. Penny Spickins is the person who's worked mostly in the evolution of compassion, but she's also became part of that project in South Africa, and is interested in some of these other types of virtue, if you like, which are even harder to try and work to discover. But she also has agreed that if someone was full of pride, it would be more or less impossible for them to have done these kinds of stone tool manufacturing techniques. And I think that this is interesting theologically, because if we believe the book of Genesis, then has some bearing to what happened in human history, then pride is the root of the first sin. It was the attempt to become like God that seemed to disrupt relationships with God, one another, and the earth as well. So it was, if you like, the elevation or the capacity for humility, though, that came first, followed by pride. If we look at classic theology and the way it understands the relationship between humility, justice, and magnanimity, then humility opposes pride, but it also is complemented by magnanimity. Pride then pulls the inner life away from justice and away from God, whereas magnanimity prevents humility from becoming self-debasing. And in that sense, I think it's very important to see these as all working together. You'll notice I also put there a prerequisite for faith, because without humility, you're not going to have any possibility of faith. But also, with humility, you are then more likely, at least, to be open to the work of God's grace. I'm not saying that this necessarily happened in these early hominin societies, but I'm saying that without these patient workings out, then humility wouldn't have enlarged in the way it did. On the other hand, the idea that humility is important has been resisted by a number of prominent thinkers through history. David Hume in the 18th century called it a monkish virtue, which served no purpose and was even a vice. In the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, said much the same thing. And very recently, indeed, Yuval Harari has written a very influential book that some of you may have seen because it's sold over, I think it's 1 billion copies, or at least 1 million, Homo Deus. But it's not really about us and God at all. It's about an anti-humility, if you like. It's about our human achievements because of our own resources and our own inventiveness. And he believes in the collapse of traditional religion, and in its place becomes big data. It's a very kind of sinister, in my view, understanding of what's going to happen next. But it is all about transhumanism. It's about humanity achieving its ends through self-aggrandizement. So it's an anti-humility. I'm not going to go into any more details of that now, but there are opponents to this view as well, who aren't necessarily theologians or philosophers. Mark Button, for example, who works in political science, believes that without humility, it's impossible to have a complete socio-political functioning system or a functioning society. Mary Keyes, who's in the legal profession, also believes that humility promotes justice and peace. So there are those, as it were, who are swimming against this view. But if we think about humility, then in relation to early human life and early human societies, then it seems that humility enabled those early humans to cope with these experiments in practice. Again, the fact that many of these artifacts appear and disappear shows that many of the experiments were a failure. But at the same time, there was a persistence there, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting there and I wouldn't be standing here today. I think, if we go to Thomas Aquinas, he may give us some clues about how to understand humility in more depth than we've done already. First of all, what is humility in the Summa Theologia? The Summa Theologia he wrote for his monks in the monastery is a basic textbook, although most of us, when they're reading the Summa Theologia today, find it's quite a hard read, so there must have been very bright monks who were able to find this as a basic text. And for him, humility is about, again, right relationships. But right relationships are core to the moral life. They're also, the moral life is also about receptivity to God's word. So it's not just about reason in relation to the reason exercised over passions and desires, but it's also about being receptive to God's word. And sometimes that part of Thomas Aquinas' thinking gets neglected. He was a very biblically minded scholar. He was, if you like, thoroughly soaked in the biblical studies, but also in the work of Augustine. And he used that frequently and engaged then with Aristotle as well, which is another reason why I find him particularly interesting, because he's mediating between the philosophers of his time and the science of his time and theology and biblical studies, although it wasn't such a thing as biblical studies then. It was all much the same. So self-control then for Thomas wasn't a lack of emotional attunement, but much more about self-regulation that was still tuned into the life of self and the life of others. So we shouldn't think of this as being sort of shut off from our emotive selves. It's not really like that at all. Humility is related to the virtue of temperance, most in a primary sense, so it's like a sub-virtue of temperance. And humility curtails pride, it celebrates the gifts of others, and it also is, as I said, related to temperance and is part of what makes temperance possible. Magnanimity, on the other hand, recognizes the failure in others where the gifts are unused. So it's not just about pointing out other people's faults, but it's about saying, well, these gifts are not being used in the way they could be used. It's related to courage. You could say it's a sub-virtue of courage. When it allows a person to become great, but without exercising pride. So overall, we need then to learn how to exercise our humility and be able to be restrain our tendency towards pride and other tendencies, which are all part of the human condition. There are two kinds of humility that came out of early tool use, two types of learning, I mean. The first is imitative learning, which, again, must have involved a great humility, given how much it was repeated over the years. And the second one was emulative learning, which, again, was almost certainly required magnanimity. The first one, imitative learning, was characteristic of the Oldman period, which I showed you earlier, and then the second one, more the Archeolian, where there were some innovations took place. And you could say to yourself, well, why did the aesthetic sense appear at all? What was going on there? Was there some sort of sense of the divine or the transcendent? And what's particularly interesting is that around the kind of, at least within a few hundred years, when the aesthetic characteristics started to appear, it seems to be roughly the same time when Homo sapiens appeared as well. So around sort of, Homo sapiens appears around 300,000 BC, whereas these are 500,000 BC. I'm not saying that Homo sapiens is necessarily responsible for these kinds of creations, probably, almost certainly not. But something was going on in the human lineage around that time, which I think was important. Christopher Boehm is another anthropologist who's written a really interesting book on moral origins. In this case, his strands of research are more about shame. And shame is, if you like, connected to temperance, and which is also connected to humility. So if we understand a little bit about shame, then maybe we can understand a little bit more about humility. And he believes that the kinds of sensitivity to one is similar to that of the other. So shame then is about feelings in relation to others in the moral sense. And so if we are in a situation of shame, then we're not going to be in a position to exercise humility and so on. So just as humility is correct judgment of self in relation to others, shame is about recognizing that maybe we haven't got those relationships right. And shame is also needed to build up a conscience as well. Thomas Aquinas, going back to him again briefly, believes that sham humility was a great temptation in the monastery, where we put on a show of humility, but one which wasn't really genuine. So it was possible to actually have pride that was covered up by the sham humility. So it becomes even more complicated than you might think. Humility then, to quote Thomas again, humility makes someone subject to the rule of reason in every field. But again, that rule of reason is not the kind of reason that we think it is, but it's more of a connectivity to God. But he also recognized the central role of charity as well. And I'm going to just give you a quotation on that. Humility, as it were, disposes to humanity's free access to spiritual and divine blessings, yet as a perfection is better than a disposition to it, so charity and the other virtues which move directly into God's company are nobler and more potent than humility. The point is that charity for him is still the supreme virtue. Even though I've said a lot about humility tonight, we mustn't forget the importance of charity. So it takes away any sense that humility is the prime virtue. It's more the enabling virtue that allows the others to be possible. And here's an example of the ordering of virtues as well. So you have the theological virtues at the top, and then the intellectual virtues, science, understanding, and wisdom. Justice is then next. Humility comes after that, alongside practical wisdom. And then the moral virtues then flow after that. So you need the humility there if you're going to have the moral virtues function aright. And you also need practical wisdom if those moral virtues are going to function aright as well. So the combination of both humility and practical wisdom is probably a more proactive virtue than humility. Humility, if you like, clears the space so to allow these other things to be possible. I'm nearly done now. And Thomas also says this, that not only is humility learned or acquired in dense community life, but it's also possible to have humility infused. And this is particularly interesting because it's something that, of course, the anthropologists will deny that anything like this is possible. But I think it's worth thinking this through and thinking what that might mean. He says, there are two roads to humility. The first and main way is by the gift of grace, and here the inward preceded the outward. The second is by human effort, and here a man or person begins by ruling his outward motions, and so gets down to the root of their disorder. The stages of humility are here enumerated according to this second way. And then he goes on to say what the different stages of humility are, that eventually, he's referring here to the rule of St. Benedict. But just like in the biblical accounts, it's pride that illustrates what humility is through being its opposite. So we work out what humility is by thinking more about pride. I'm now going to draw these reflections to a conclusion. Because I wanted time to have a response and then a discussion. And I've only really just touched on some of this area. It's a really dynamic field into engaging theologians with evolutionary anthropologists. And I think it's very exciting and important to give theologians a place at that table. But humility is also particularly important in the human community. Because it seems to appear at the dawn of human becoming, when these tools and these other creations are at the very earliest stage. And if we track that, we begin to track, if you like, the changes in mind and the changes in the possibility of openness to God as well at the same time. What kind of evidence, though, might we need to show that humility was really practiced or not? These are still slightly, they're unanswered questions. What about evidence for pride? When can we see examples of that coming in the human community? What about the artifacts themselves? Can we search for other ones that will give us other clues about the importance or the role of the aesthetic sense, this very, very early form of art? And again, some fairly interesting discoveries recently in Spain have suggested that handprints have been made by Neanderthals and not just Homo sapiens, so it's backing up the same argument again. Is there some sort of intimation of the divine in some of these artistic creations or not? Now, should notice too that archaeologists or evolutionary anthropologists will say that, or will explain or talk about religion as an inner projection of the self onto something else, onto another, whereas as theologians we reject that and challenge that and say, well, actually it was a real presence that they were encountering, not just a projection of some sort of mental change. On the other hand, did humility extend to the objects themselves, just as compassion seems to be extended to objects beyond the human and the other animals? So was there some sort of submission then to the objects? If I think about my own teenagers and how they submit to the iPhone, I begin to think that this isn't quite so impossible either. So further than archaeological research will require scientists to go out and search for some of these things, but I think they should be accompanied by theologians, prompting them and probing them to ask different kinds of questions. But by engaging in this kind of work, I also genuinely believe that it keeps theologians humble about our own contributions, humble before the evidence, humble before the ignorance that we have about the early life of early humans and what it might mean for us today. I think it's also necessary to keep probing these questions in a new way, and I think we need to contribute to theological and scientific research and insight where they're working together rather than in opposition to one another. And with that, I will hand over to my respondent, whoever. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this lecture. So the remaining format is we will have a response by Dr. Craig Gay, who is Professor for Interdisciplinary Studies here at Regent. And after that, we will turn it over to you for questions. So the remaining hominibus sapientibus in the audience. And Professor Gay, if you would come and give a response,
Thank you.
Please.
I just have to figure out how to, is my mic on? It's working? Great. Well, thank you, Celia. Now, as Jens has said, I am Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies here at Regent College. And just some context here. Modern academic life, it seems, forces people to specialize. And interdisciplinarity is supposed to be a kind of antidote to this modern trend. But there's a joke about this. And it is that whereas the specialist comes to know more and more about less and less, until eventually they come to know almost everything about almost nothing, the professor of interdisciplinary studies comes to know less and less about more and more until he comes to the point of knowing almost nothing about almost everything. And I confess that this is kind of how I feel in trying to respond to Celia's presentation. I know next to nothing about evolutionary anthropology and early hominid development. I have only the most rudimentary understanding of how Stone Age implements were actually fashioned. And most of what I know, I suspect, is probably wrong. And I've had relatively few occasions to dive into the moral theology of Thomas Aquinas. But this is all good because it means that I can begin my response by acknowledging the incompleteness of my understanding of many, if not most, of the issues that Celia has raised in her presentation. And it is just this kind of acknowledgement, or as she has put it, this proper evaluation of self in relation to others, that she has defined as humility and wants to draw our attention to. So let me humbly say just a few things in response to Celia's presentation. The first thing I want to say is just how very interesting it is this bridging between archaeology and evolutionary anthropology, moral theology, theological anthropology. Wow, there's a lot of stuff in there. And not only does this warm my interdisciplinary heart, but I think it models the kind of openness to the findings of other disciplines that ought to characterize good Christian scholarship, and especially ought to characterize good theology. Now, the contemporary intellectual environment is increasingly full of studies that seek to illuminate current problems and issues with the insights of evolutionary biology and anthropology. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, just published this year, is an example of this, as is Francis Fukuyama's On the Origins of Political Order, published just a few years ago. Origins that Fukuyama traces back into deep evolutionary time. Now, to see a Christian theologian taking a similar tack and interacting seriously with this scientific material is, I think, a very good thing. And Celia is modeling good Christian scholarship in this way, and I'm grateful to you for that. Now, along this line, I'm tempted to say that she is being very Regent College. But, of course, she's already told you she is an alumna of Regent College. But this is the kind of thing we try to encourage here at the college. Now, the second thing I want to say is how intriguing and how mind-expanding, really, it is to be encouraged to think about all of the sorts of mental and moral habits that must somehow have been necessary for our distant ancestors to have produced things like stone hand axes. I don't think we appreciate how difficult this must have been and how much patience and diligence it must have taken. Of course, we can still admire craftsmanship, though in our increasingly machine-built world, most of us no longer have any direct experience of it. But I think we're still dimly aware that craftsmanship entails diligence and patience over time, over long periods of time, and that it depends upon a number of relationships that must be respected and properly observed. For example, between teacher and student, or master and apprentice, between masters, apprentices, and the natural materials they work with, and between masters, apprentices, and the larger community that must support their crafting. You simply don't get a beautifully crafted and balanced stone axe without a lot of effort on the part of a lot of individuals who are cooperatively related to each other over time in ways that make this production possible. Being sensitive to proper relationship is then one of the ways that Celia has defined humility. And it's interesting to speculate that such humble cooperation might well have opened up the minds of our distant ancestors to begin to reflect upon their proper relationship, not just to one another, but to the larger world, to nature, and perhaps even to begin to reflect upon their proper relationship to what or who might originally have fashioned the natural order of things. Or perhaps, as Celia also suggests, the kind of self-control required to craft stone tools may well have stimulated those parts of the brain also responsible for emotional and relational maturity, trustworthiness, and responsibility. And so opened the minds of our distant, may have opened the minds of our distant relatives up to begin to reflect upon what, or again, who might ultimately be responsible for their existence. That such creatures might thus have been prepared, as the Apostle Paul argued in Athens, to seek, to reach out, and perhaps to find God, is extremely interesting and thought-provoking, and I'm grateful to you for this. Now, the third and final point that I want to make has to do with Celia's mention of modernity's criticism of humility. And she has specifically cited Friedrich Nietzsche and David Hume. To be fair, I don't think that either Nietzsche or Hume would have objected to humility defined, as Celia has defined it, as the proper or accurate perception of self in relation to others, or even as, quote, a willingness to restrain the desire for self-aggrandizement in the interests of cooperative action. Neither Nietzsche nor Hume would have been bothered by this. Both thinkers placed a high value upon cooperative action and, by extension, upon those virtues that facilitated cooperation and collaboration. So, when Hume, for example, lists humility along with celibacy, fasting, penance, mortification, self-denial, silence, and solitude as among the monkish virtues, which he believes are actually vices, he seems rather to have in mind humility as self-abasement, or a kind of distorted and or otherwise improper estimation of oneself and of one's own value. And yet, when humility is understood, as Celia also suggests, as the acknowledgement of the incompleteness of one's powers, especially when one's powers are compared with divine perfection, well, then I can certainly imagine Hume and Nietzsche objecting, probably vigorously. And they would say that this does represent a destructively false modesty, an improper self-abasement, and a denigration of human potential. And hasn't such a refusal to acknowledge the incompleteness of human powers vis-a-vis those of God become axiomatic within modern technological society and culture? For example, in the repudiation of the notion that the nature of things should circumscribe and place limits around human creativity. Indeed, in the original Cartesian suggestion that we are to become the masters and possessors of nature by means of science and technology. And hasn't the rejection of humility understood as the relativization of human powers over and against those of nature, capital N, or the gods, cleared the path for the wonders of modern scientific and technological development, for enlightenment now, to cite the title of Steven Pinker's recent best-selling book, which we're told is Bill Gates' all-time favorite. So, I guess I'm not quite sure that the fact that paleoanthropologists have discovered evidence of social cooperation among early hominids, cooperation that must have required something like humility defined as sensitivity to proper relationship, I'm just not sure that this is going to motivate modern men and women to reevaluate how they develop and or use modern technology. Now, of course, there is other anthropological evidence that might help. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Ronald Wright's book A Short History of Progress, published in 2005, in which he reflects on how a number of complex and apparently successful civilizations nevertheless collapsed and failed in the face of ecological and social problems that they must surely have seen looming. Using the fallen civilizations of Easter Island, Sumer, Rome, and the Mayan Peninsula, as well as examples from the Stone Age, Wright suggests that human societies can, in pursuing progress through human ingenuity, inadvertently introduce insidious problems that they don't possess the resources and or political will to solve. The fear of short-term losses in status, stability, and or quality of life has apparently prevented any number of once thriving human societies from successfully solving the social and environmental problems that their own development, their progress, created. And this in spite of the fact that some of these problems, such as the elimination of all of the trees from Easter Island, must have been painfully obvious to all concerned. And yet, failing to address these problems, these societies inevitably collapsed. As Wright observes then, and this is a quote, he says, "Many of the great ruins that grace the deserts and jungles of the earth are monuments to progress traps, the headstones of civilizations which fell victim to their own success. In the fates of such societies, once mighty, complex, and brilliant, lie the most instructive lessons. They are fallen airliners whose black boxes can tell us what went wrong." So, here then is an additional kind of anthropological evidence that might now give us a clue as to how we perhaps ought to think about modern technology. And yet, although it's undoubtedly true that our aversion to short-term losses in status, stability, and or quality of life often impede our ability correctly to assess modern technological development, our problem would seem to run deeper than the fear of loss and or political indecision. After all, the general consensus today is that more technology is the solution to many of our problems, not the problem itself. Now, the key resource we appear to lack in confronting modern technological development is not political courage. Rather, it is our inability to imagine any other way beyond that of problem-solving inventiveness of being in the world. As the Canadian philosopher George Grant once observed, a technological society is one in which people think of the world around them as mere indifferent stuff, which they are absolutely free to control any way they want through technology. It is a whole way of looking at the world, the basic way Western people experience their own existence, their own experience in the world. And out of it comes large organizations, bureaucracy, machines, and the belief that all problems can be solved scientifically. The technological society is one in which people are bent on dominating and controlling human and non-human nature. Now, the flip side of this, of course, is the death of God. A death, as Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, once commented, has only become plausible in a context in which we have become increasingly incapable of apprehending a reality absolutely independent of ourselves. As a result, Buber continued, the unbelieving marrow of the capricious modern person cannot perceive anything but unbelief and caprice, positing ends and devising means. Their world is devoid of sacrifice and grace and counter presence, but it is shot through with means and ends. But All of this, I think, is probably taking us off topic and away from Celia's excellent presentation. And so let me just wrap up my comments by saying that it would seem that we are today in rather desperate need of the infused humility that Thomas Aquinas suggested must be the gift of God. Thank you.